Hello and welcome. All right, so I believe we're on time today. My name is Katie Nosker, and I'm the manager of the Supportive Housing Connection. I'm here joined by Jessica Barnes, who's the administrative assistant for the Supportive Housing Connection, and Cathy Boland from DMHAS, and Courtney Davey from DDD. Today we will be discussing how the supportive, and Bob Heater from the assistant director from the Supportive Housing Connection. Today we'll be discussing how the Supportive Housing Connection operates, some key documents that we use, as well as some changes and improvements that we're making in response to comments from both providers and landlords. As I go through each of the functional areas, I'll be drawing a comparison between the way the programs have operated and the way they'll operate in the future. After I've walked through the comparisons, I'll lead you through some flowcharts that will explain each step of the process. Throughout the webinar, you can ask questions using the Questions tab in the webinar bar. We will be collecting the questions and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Okay. The functions of the Supportive Housing Connection include housing search assistance, landlord recruitment, housing inspections, subsidy package processing, rental subsidy administration, tenant landlord inquiry resolution, and all of these services are included for HMFA financed, DDD, and DMHAS projects. In terms of the housing search, there are a number of ways that people currently find housing, and I'll be talking about how that will work under the Supportive Housing Connection. So currently, individuals themselves and/or with their advocate, provider, or guardian can locate housing. That remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. Also currently, individuals choose DDD licensed housing settings that they are referred to by DDD based on DDD policy. Again, that remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. The only difference now is that the Supportive Housing Connection will be providing tools to locate housing and to assist with landlord recruitment. So, tenants can find housing in a number of ways, with the assistance of their provider or advocate, on their own, or through a referral by DDD to a licensed housing setting. The Supportive Housing Connection can connect tenants with tools and resources to locate housing. I do want to emphasize here that the Supportive Housing Connection will not actually take tenants out to view these units. Also, in terms of the housing search, we have the New Jersey Housing Resource Center, which is an HMFA service and tool to find housing. It is a searchable, interactive, online database of affordable and accessible housing units located throughout the state of New Jersey. It includes 30 general and advanced search fields, many of which relate to accessibility features. There's also a toll-free call center number that's available in both Spanish and English. This database is managed by SocialServe, which is a nonprofit that provides housing locator tools to states and localities throughout the country. So, to enhance the number of affordable housing opportunities, the Supportive Housing Connection is performing landlord recruitment. Specifically, we will be working with SocialServe to recruit new landlords to participate in this program. We're providing training and assistance to these new and existing landlords. The SHC is also working with HMFA financed, DDD, and DMHAS projects to provide technical assistance where it's applicable. SocialServe will be sending out email blasts, making phone calls, and creating flyers to encourage current and prospective landlords to post units that are at or below the fair market rent, or FMR, on the New Jersey Housing Resource Center. While we're talking about landlords, I do want to talk a little bit about the HAP agreement and SHC Addendum, and I'll show you both of those at the end of the webinar so that you have a sense of these two documents. But the HAP contract for Section 8 is also used along with an SHC Addendum. This is an agreement between the Supportive Housing Connection and the landlord regarding the DHS subsidy, as well as the SHC's policies and procedures. These need to be signed before a tenant leases a unit. I also want to be clear here that we need one HAP, or Housing Assistance Payment contract, per landlord. Then we need one SHC addendum per tenant. In terms of housing inspections, currently for DDD licensed settings, there is a pre-inspection that's done by DDD staff. That remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. Also currently, for DHS licensed settings, there's an inspection done by the DHS Office of Licensing. That also remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. Now, for DMHAS, provider agencies had been performing housing inspections. Under the SHC, these inspections will be completed by trained SHC and affiliated staff for all DDD and DMHAS unlicensed units. The housing inspections that we do are based on HUD housing quality standards, and these standards are intended to ensure that tenants live in safe, decent, and affordable housing. This also applies to HMFA financed DDD and DMHAS projects. These inspections are conducted prior to move-in, annually, and on an as-needed basis. HQS requires that we check a number of different items and places in the home. They include living rooms, bathrooms, kitchens, other rooms, the building exterior plumbing and heating, as well as for health and safety issues. I also want to note here, in terms of housing inspections, that the Supportive Housing Connection is now partnering with Gilson Software Solutions to provide inspection scheduling services. This means that Gilson is now working with tenants, providers, and landlords to schedule initial, annual, and special inspections. In terms of subsidy package processing, and we'll get into what exactly a subsidy package is, currently DMHAS had sent their subsidy packages to DMHAS staff. Also currently for DDD, housing costs were bundled with service costs in their budget or contract. Under the SHC, these packages will be sent directly to the SHC for processing. So what does this include? It includes items from both the landlord and the tenant. From the landlord, we need the signed HAP and SHC addendum. We need direct deposit information for the landlord and their W-9. It is really critical that we get that W-9 because the IRS requires that we have that document in order to make these payments. From the tenant, we need current income documents, their lease, the tenant's information form, and the SHC uses the same rental subsidy calculation methodology as currently used by DMHAS, as well as the signed tenant's rental subsidy agreement. And there's a separate version of this document for DDD tenants as well as DMHAS tenants. Income will be calculated according to DHS standards, which includes initially before the tenant moves in, annually around the anniversary of their lease date, as their income changes, and every 6 months for consumers who report no income. The SHC will be notifying both the landlord and the tenant of the amounts to be paid by the tenant and the subsidy amount to be paid by the SHC. We think it's very important to make sure that everyone is on the same page with this correspondence. The provider is also copied. In terms of subsidy payments, Currently, rental subsidies or housing costs are paid to provider agencies who use those funds to pay landlords. Moving forward under the SHC will make rental subsidy payments directly to the landlords. Also currently, in unlicensed settings, tenants pay their portion directly to the landlord. That remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. And lastly, currently, in licensed settings, tenants pay their contribution to care. Moving forward under the SHC, tenants will pay their rental portion directly to the landlord. So in sum, the SHC will make the rental subsidy payment on behalf of DHS each month via direct deposit into the landlord's account. DHS, for now, is going to continue making payments for the furniture stipend, fire suppression funds, security deposits, and utility startup funds. You will be notified as these processes move to the SHC. In terms of tenant-landlord inquiry resolution, or kind of a conflict mediation service that we provide, currently, landlords and individuals, with the assistance of their provider agencies, work together to resolve housing-related issues. That remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. Also currently, landlords and individuals sometimes contact DHS for assistance. Under the SHC, landlords and individuals can contact the SHC if these issues cannot be resolved. So service providers can continue to assist and advocate for their service recipients. The SHC will be a centralized location to receive inquiries from tenants and landlords. And in some instances, these issues will be elevated to DHS or other parties. So you may be wondering when to contact the Supportive Housing Connection. And the answer is that it's after the landlord, tenant, and provider agency have attempted to resolve the housing-related issues among themselves first. So here are a few examples of the types of housing situations that the SHC can help resolve. And they include issues related to the tenant and landlord relationship, violations of HUD housing quality standards that are not remedied in a timely manner. So a few examples there, if the hot water is not working, the heat's not working, or maybe a window is broken. And any questions or concerns involving SHC policies and practices. In terms of the timeline, the program was launched in February of 2015, and it ramps up as DHS transfers both existing and new subsidies to the Supportive Housing Connection. As of today, June 30th, 2016, the Supportive Housing Connection is serving 3,364 tenants. Existing participants will be notified via mail, email, or phone and assisted through this transition. Okay, now I'd like to take a little bit of time and go through some process flows that we have related to how this process works so you guys can get a visual of how this operates. So I'll go through first an overview of how the whole process works together, and then we'll take a closer look at how this looks from the tenant's perspective and the landlord's perspective. Okay. The overall process begins when the Department of Human Services approves a tenant for subsidy. So I do want to emphasize that here, that the SHC makes no determination of who is or is not eligible for a subsidy. All such decisions like that are made by the Department of Human Services. DHS then sends the tenant's information to the Supportive Housing Connection. The SHC then issues a welcome letter to the tenant. Now, there are a couple different things that can happen here. So if the tenant has already located a unit, that's great. The Supportive Housing Connection would jump right to inspecting the unit. If the tenant has not yet identified a unit, the tenant would then find a unit with help from the provider and the supportive housing connection. Either way, once they've located a unit, the supportive housing connection will perform an inspection. If we go out and we find that there is a deficiency, that's HQS language for something that does not meet HQS standards, the supportive housing connection will then work with the landlord to correct that deficiency wherever possible. It then goes back for another inspection, and once it passes, the tenant and landlord would send the SHC all the required documents. The SHC would then process the subsidy package. The SHC would then notify the landlord and tenant of the contribution by the tenant and the subsidy. The SHC would then begin paying the rental subsidy. The tenant moves into the unit. The SHC would then provide the rental subsidy until the end of the lease term. Now, the SHC would then contact both the tenant and the landlord about 4 months prior to lease expiration to find out the status. So here's where the tenant and landlord have some decisions to make. So the tenant can say, you know what, I love the unit, I love the program, I'd like to stay here. So that's this yes current unit line. So that's wonderful. If that's the case, then the supportive housing connection goes right to inspecting the unit, working with the landlord to correct any issues as they arise. We need to collect the documentation again, process the subsidy package. We let everybody know what their rent contributions will be, and we actually make the payments and move forward. Now, the tenant can also say, you know what, I really love this program, but this unit's not really working out. And that's fine too, so that's this yes new unit line here. So if that's the case, we loop back to the tenant finding a unit with help from the provider and the SHC. Once they've found a unit, they let us know with the unit identification form what unit it is they would like us to inspect. We go out, inspect it, and the process loops back again. Now, the tenant can also say, you know what, I'm moving out of state to live with family, or something to that nature, and if they will not be participating in the program anymore, they would exit the program and the lease would be terminated. So that is an overview of the process. Next, I'll go through the tenant's perspective. So this is what the whole process looks like from the tenant's perspective. So again, this process begins when DHS approves that tenant for subsidy. DHS then sends that tenant's information over to the supportive housing connection. We then prepare a welcome package for the tenant, and from the tenant's perspective, that's when they get.
You can't see this.
Oh, I can't see any of these?
No.
Okay. I apologize. Justice let me know that you guys can't see these process flows. I apologize. I didn't realize. Let's see. Okay. Thank you. I apologize. I guess I should go back to the overview. Got to open that one up then. I'm sorry. How about that? Okay, all right. I'm sorry, guys. Let me go through that real quick because I know you heard it before. So the process starts when DHS approves the tenant for subsidy. DHS then sends the tenant's information to the SHC. We send a welcome letter to the tenant. If they don't have a unit, they go out and find the unit with help from the provider and SHC. Either way, once they've located a unit, it goes to inspecting the unit. If there are any deficiencies or any failures, we work with the landlord to correct that deficiency where possible. We loop back to conducting the inspection. Once it passes, we get all the required documents from the tenant and landlord. the SHC processes the subsidy package. We then notify the landlord and the tenant of the contribution by the tenant and subsidy. Then we begin paying the rental subsidy. Tenant moves into the unit. The SHC provides the rental subsidy until the lease term is up. And then 4 months prior to the end of the lease, the SHC would contact both the tenant and the landlord to determine the status, and the process loops back around. Okay. All right, so here we have I'm sorry. So here we have the tenant's flow chart. All right, so again, the process starts when DHS approves the tenant for a subsidy. DHS sends the tenant's information to the SHC. The SHC prepares the welcome packet for the tenant. The tenant then receives that welcome packet from the SHC. If they have already identified a unit, we go right to inspecting the unit. If not, the tenant would then find a unit with the providers and SHC's assistance, and they would then notify us of the unit chosen. So this is, as I'd mentioned, the unit identification form, and that's a really critical form for us. We'll go through it a bit more in a minute, but it's really critical that we get that form so that we can perform the inspection as quickly as possible. Either way, the SHC then inspects the unit. If the unit fails, we work with the landlord to correct that deficiency where possible, and the process loops around. If the unit does not pass, the tenant would go out and find another unit with the providers and SHC's assistance, let us know of the new unit, and we would perform the inspection. Once we get a pass, the tenant would then need to send the following documents to the Supportive Housing Connection. That includes the signed tenant's rental subsidy agreement, income documentation, their lease, the tenant's information form. The SHC would then process that subsidy package. The tenant would then be notified by the SHC of both the subsidy amount as well as the tenant's contribution. The tenant and SHC would then make both of their contributions towards the rent. The tenant would then move into the unit. The tenant and SHC would then continue to pay their contributions through the lease term. And then about 120 days, or about 4 months prior to the tenant's lease date, they would receive a letter from the Supportive Housing Connection to determine the tenant's status. And this is where the tenant has that same choice again. They can say, you know what, yes, I'd love to continue in this program and I want to stay in this unit. If so, that's great. We loop back to inspecting the unit, collecting the same documents, processing the subsidy package. We then let everybody know what the contribution amounts will be. The SHC and tenant both then make their contributions and continue to pay them through the lease term. The tenant, again, can also say, you know what, I do love the program, but I'd really prefer another unit. That's perfectly fine. The process then loops back to the tenant finding a unit with the providers and SHC's assistance. We then need another unit ID form because this is a new unit that the tenant would like to live in. We then inspect the unit, collect the documents, process the subsidy package, and notify the tenant of the amount, etc. Now, if the tenant decides, again, maybe they're moving out of state, maybe they don't want to participate in the program anymore, or maybe they've gotten Section 8 or something like that, the subsidy would then not be renewed at the end of the lease term. This would be kind of the tenant exiting the program. All right. So now let's go through the landlord process. So what this looks like from the landlord's perspective. Okay, so we get a lot of questions around the landlord process. We get landlords who call us and say, you know, hey, I'd love to participate in this program. Do I have to be pre-qualified or something like that? And the answer is that they do not have to be pre-qualified. For landlords who are interested in participating in the program, we encourage them to list their units on the New Jersey Housing Resource Center. But the process for the landlords really begins when a tenant contacts them to view the unit. The landlord then views the application, and if it's not going to work out, they let the tenant know. Assuming it does, they would need to send the following documents to the Supportive Housing Connection. That includes their payment information, the HAP and SHC Addendum, and they'd have to let the tenant know the lease information. The SHC then reviews these documents, and you know, if the landlord doesn't want to work with the SHC, you know, then we may have to revisit some things, but assuming all of that works out just fine, the SHC then inspects the unit. We work with the landlord to correct any deficiencies. Once the unit passes, the SHC, the landlord receives a letter from the SHC stating that the unit passed and notifying them of the tenant and subsidy contribution. The landlord then receives the first month's rent and the security deposit. Tenant moves into the unit. The landlord then receives the rental subsidy and rental contribution each month for the lease term. And now, again, 4 months or 120 days prior to the lease term, the SHC sends some documentation to the landlord to find out the status. And here the landlord also has a lease renewal decision to make. They can say, you know what, this relationship's not working out, or maybe the tenant is you know, leaving the state or whatever the case may be. And if so, the lease would terminate and the landlord would no longer receive subsidy from the SHC. I do want to be clear here that the SHC cannot pay for units if the tenant is not there unless we've received other notification from the Department of Human Services. There are some limited cases where that has happened. So assuming the tenant wants to stay in the unit, we loop back to collecting documentation, including payment and, you know, making sure that we've got all our documents lined up. We need the lease information. We review the documentation, inspect the unit, work with the landlord to correct any deficiencies where necessary. After the unit passes, they receive a letter from the SHC stating that it passed and letting everybody know what the contribution amounts are. They then receive the rent, and we loop back around. So that's what all this looks like from the landlord's perspective. Now let me go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. Oh boy. They see it? I don't see anything. I'm sorry, I'm experiencing some technical difficulties over here. There we go. I hear my... Okay. Okay. Just be back on? Okay, great. So next I want to go through a few different documents that we use in the process of working with tenants and landlords. So we have a few here. So the first one that I want to talk about is the unit identification form. So that's listed here. And I just want to go through a little bit of this information. So it's very, very critical that, first of all, that we get this information, as soon as a provider has it and knows that it's accurate, to give us as much time, as much notice as possible to go out and perform the inspection. So we need the tenant's name, the date of submittal, the proposed address that the tenant is moving into. And I just want to point out a couple of things that are often not filled in this top section. And one is this preferred move-in date. It's really important that you let us know when that tenant wants to get in, as well as the monthly rent. So the reason we'd like this filled in is because it's a quick check for us to see if it looks like that unit is going to come in under or above the fair market rent. So this is the first place that we look to make sure that it's under the fair market rent. We do ask that the landlord organization information be filled in as completely as possible. The reason we need this information is twofold. One, to set that landlord up correctly in our system, and two, so that we have contact information for that landlord in order to schedule the inspection. So this is really critical information for us. The last information on a unit identification form is information about the provider. And quite frankly, this is the information that we most often don't have filled in on our unit ID forms. And we really want to encourage everyone to please make sure that that's filled in before it's sent to the Supportive Housing Connection. We like this information because that's how Gilson Software Solutions, which is the entity that's doing the inspection scheduling, knows who to contact to schedule that inspection. We know how critical it is that social service provider agencies be contacted, notified at every step through this process, and filling this in helps us serve you best. So please keep that in mind when you're filling out those forms and sending them in to us. Okay, I'd also like to talk through the, let's go through a tenant's information worksheet. So that's this one. You may start to see that there's a little bit of repetitive information here, but what this does is this particular form, and you'll see that there's a signature on behalf of the tenant here. This is the form that officially allows the SHC to work with all of the entities that they list here in reference to their case. So this emergency contact information, this is information, if the tenant has an advocate, somebody who's very involved and wants to be maybe copy on correspondence, wants to know when inspections are, things like that. We encourage people to fill that in. It could, a mother, a sister, a neighbor, something like that. We get all kinds of things, in that emergency contact field. We ask for the provider information again so that we can make sure that our records are complete. We ask to know who all is in the household so that we can keep our records up to date. Landlord information, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with where the tenant's living. And one of the new things that we have on this form is this piece about income sources. So the first thing I want to say is that we are constantly going in and trying to improve our forms, our process, in order to serve everyone better. So this is a new element to one of the forms that we have. But I'll also emphasize that if somebody has an old version of a form, that's perfectly fine too. We certainly accept those. The reason we added this is because we've found that there have been a number of instances where maybe the SHC was just not aware that a tenant had multiple sources of income. If we get a package in that just has, say, benefits and does not have, the recent pay stubs from their job, we're only as good as the information that we have, so we would use what we have. But this piece here allows the provider or tenant to list all of their income sources, which lets us compare that to what we actually have on file to make sure that we have everything that we should have. So those are some of the most important points about the tenant's information form. So now I'd like to talk about the HAP contract, just very briefly because we've talked about this one already. But I did want to show it here so that everyone had a sense of what this document is, why it's used. Early in the program, we had a document that was called the Landlord Agreement. And we got some pushback from some really prominent landlords that had a number of tenants in our program. So we worked really closely with them, and it was determined that these landlords were most comfortable working with the HAP contract. They were comfortable with the language in here. It's used by HUD all the time. So to accommodate them, we said, okay, you know, if we're willing to use this document. So just to clarify again, we need this document only once for each landlord. Now, what we have added is the SHC Addendum to the HAP contract. So we definitely hear a lot of questions from landlords and providers about the HAP contract. And they say, well, you know, that it's a great document, but it does not reference the SHC. So we absolutely agree about that. So we created the Supportive Housing Connection Addendum to the HAP contract. And what this does is make it clear that everywhere in the HAP contract where it says HUD, that should be replaced by SHC. It also clarifies a few items related to state law. So, you know, there's nothing in here that is outside of what the law and fair housing already require. We do have in here some important information. So we do ask for this particular document to be submitted by the landlord for each tenant. And the reason we want this one for each tenant is because it allows the landlord to tell us what record they have of who is living in this unit, which we can compare to ours and make sure that they match. We also have, this is very important too, this utilities page. As you're probably aware, if tenants are paying for utilities out of pocket, then they get a $70 utility allowance. So this lets us know, you know, from the landlord what utilities the tenant is paying for themselves. You know, what's included in the lease, what's not. So this is great information for us to have from the landlord, and then it gets signed from the landlord as well. So that concludes our review of documents. Now I'd like to jump back to the slideshow. Okay, and I want to talk a little bit about some improvements that the SHC is making at this time and how they impact provider organizations. So, in response to feedback that we've received, we've decided to do a number of things. And the first is to actually reorganize our staff in two primary meaningful ways. So one is that we have organized our staff into teams. And each team will be led by an eligibility specialist. And she will work with one or two processors to make sure that information is received, recorded, and acted upon in a timely and accurate manner. This will help as individuals, you know, on staff are out sick or on vacation to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. So we're really excited about this one. The next thing we're doing related to reorganizing our staff is that we are setting up our caseloads such that each processor will be assigned to a certain set of provider agencies. These provider agencies will be able to communicate with one SHC staff person moving forward in regards to the collection of documents. We've already set up these relationships in our system, and the recertification letters that went out this month for tenants whose lease dates are up in October already reflect these assignments. Now, this does mean that we will have a bit of a slow and steady transition. The bottom line is that providers should please continue to communicate with the individual individual SHC staff member who's listed on all of your new or recertification letters. The difference is that by this fall, after October, providers will be communicating consistently with one SHC staff person. And we will be sending out the list of providers and staff assignments shortly. So I understand that this will be a bit of a, potentially confusing transition. And I do want to be clear that we thought about a number of different ways to go through with this transition. And what we came up with is what I think will be the least disruptive to servicing, both the tenants, providers, landlords, things like that. And that is that we have set in our system those new assignments, but it will roll in very slowly. So if a provider agency is communicating with, say, 3 different eligibility specialists right now, please continue to work with those folks, and that by kind of the end of the fall, you'll be communicating consistently with one SHC staff member. So we hope that this will go a long way towards improving these relationships. I do want to point out that we have one senior eligibility specialist, Shakan Cruz, who has been assigned to particular landlords. There are only 3, but they have requested some special treatment. So that's what we have given them. So I do want to point out that there are a small number of tenants, it's approximately 45, 47, something like that, where it may not line up exactly to the provider agency working with one SHC staff member. There are these small number of tenants who will continue to work with Shakan specifically because those landlords have requested it. So we will be communicating all of this in an email to you guys soon. Next, we are working on 2 portals, one for landlords and one for providers, which will allow for much better and easier communication of information. These portals will allow each entity to log in and view information that we have on file for their respective tenants. This information will include their address, inspection status, and information about subsidy payments that have been made on the tenant's behalf. Landlords and providers will also be able to log in, and I think this is very exciting, electronically submit documentation to us in a secure fashion that will encourage accountability on all sides. With this secure method, there will be no question about whether or not a document has been received because providers, landlords, and the SHC will be able to log in and view these documents. I do just want to clarify that these are separate portals. So a landlord would only log in and see the tenant information about tenants who are living in their units, and the provider could only log in and view information about providers with that organization. Now, the estimated delivery dates for these portals are the fall for the landlord portal and this winter for the provider portal. And we'll be in touch as these improvements come online. Okay. All right. Now we'd like to open it up to questions. So Jess has been collecting questions throughout this webinar. I would again encourage you, if you've not asked any already, that if you have any remaining questions, you can type them to us in the questions bar with the webinar bar that you have available to you. So with that, I'll also say that we have Cathy and Courtney here available to answer questions as they come, and I'll open it up to Jess to let us know what the questions are.
Okay. The first question is for Katie. Does SHC provide Gilson with the telephone number of the tenants so that they can confirm scheduled appointments for inspections? In the event of a problem with the scheduling of the inspection, provider agencies can then be notified. Currently, Gilson sends an email to the provider for confirmation of inspection date.
Okay, so we only have the tenant's phone number if that's been provided to us so far. If we have it, it does go over to Gilson, but one thing you guys can do to help us there is include that phone number in the unit ID form. There is a spot for that. Let me see if I can pull that back up. Okay, let's see. Do we have a spot? We don't have a spot here for the tenant's phone number. That's a good point. We can include that. We can begin including that on our unit ID form so that you guys can give that to us, and we can make sure that Gilson gets that in their system.
All right. The next question can be for Cathy and/or Davey. Who will be inspecting the units for licensed DMHAS housing? Will that continue to be SHC staff?
No, the licensed housing is still going to be inspected by the Department of Human Services.
Okay. This one can be for anyone. There are project-based subsidies that cannot move to a different unit. Are project-based units being phased out?
Right now, project-based units are not being phased out. A lot of those units are owned by our provider agencies, and they'll continue to be project-based. As far as transitioning any of the others, that may come up, but it's not. Nothing definite has been decided about those.
Okay. This is another one that can be for anyone. Well, Katie. Let's go with Katie. Please discuss more about quote-unquote process the subsidy package. Also, who is signing leases when consumers do not have the legal capacity to enter into an agreement? Also, kindly provide information about tenant rights and responsibilities. Some tenants with disabilities are not traditional, for lack of a better phrase, well-behaved tenants.
Okay, so there was a lot in that particular question. The first one in there is what goes into processing a subsidy package. So what happens there is that our staff collect documentation from both the tenant and the landlord. So from the landlord, we need a W-9, a HAP agreement, one HAP agreement per landlord, and one SHC addendum per tenant. On the tenant side, we need their tenant's information form, we need a lease, we need their tenant's rental subsidy agreement, and their income documentation. So we get all that information in, we enter it into our system. Our system will actually let us know what those rental amounts are, and with that information we then let the provider, the tenant, and the landlord know what the contribution amounts are. So that's what that means. Jess, can you repeat some of the other parts of that question?
Who is signing leases when consumers do not have the legal capacity to enter into an agreement?
It could be the legal guardian for the individual.
Okay, and then please provide information about tenants' rights and responsibilities. Some tenants with disabilities are not traditional, well-behaved tenants.
Within the DDD, for the welcome packet for the DDD individuals, there's something called the DDD Tenant Subsidy Agreement. Within that, you will find a list of rules that the tenant must follow.
That also goes for the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Service clients. They also have a consumer agreement, and they have to follow all of those rules in the consumer agreement and our policy, which is attached to that agreement. And then, of course, they have to follow whatever is in the signed lease.
Okay. We have shared, I think this is for Katie. We have shared housing, which requires tenants to have individual rental assistance. Do we list names of all people in the household, even if they have other sources of rental assistance?
Okay, so there are a couple of situations where this can occur. So I can't quite tell if this is talking about a group home or about a tenant who has other roommates. If the tenant has other roommates, the way that situation works with the lease is that we need to know who else is on that lease. So So I think there are some situations, Courtney can correct me here, but I think in group homes, frequently each tenant may have their own lease for that room. In some other situations, we may have a tenant who is living with maybe a friend, and that friend is also on the lease. So we would want to know, certainly whoever is kind of on the lease, we definitely want kind of a record of who is in that household. If it's more like that tenant has just one room, we consider that just one unit, and that's sufficient.
For DDD individuals, anyone beyond the approved tenant living in the unit with the person is approved on a case-by-case basis. So we would know about that ahead of time.
And they said they're talking about tenants who have other roommates, not a group home. Okay. Katie, you mentioned that landlords would contact SHC to be in the program. What are the benefits for a landlord if wanting to be in the program? At first glance, it appears to be a Section 8 voucher.
One of the biggest advantages of being in this program, or having tenants in this program who are living in their buildings, is that they get the rent guaranteed and on time. That's one of the biggest advantages of being in this program, just like an advantage of Section 8, that this rent, that there's another entity here that is providing that rental subsidy, and that tenant also comes with a number of supports. So that tenant is not kind of alone in this unit, that there are other support structures around them.
Okay. And when will providers receive notice of October lease renewals? Katie?
The October recertification letters have already gone out. They went out maybe the second week of June. It was sometime mid-June, June 15th, Jess corrected me. So about June 15th they went out, so you guys should be receiving them sometime soon.
And we have one more. The State Bureau of Guardianship legal guardians are signing leases. Are you sure they will do that? I guess it was a question that we said that a guardian can sign.
We're still discussing with BGS. Legal guardians could be a family member too.
Okay, that was it.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for tuning in. Just so everybody's aware, this has been recorded, and we will be putting this webinar up on our website so that if anyone has missed this information, they'll still be able to catch up. Thank you very much.